Some killers follow you, some wait for you, but the rarest kind is already inside your walls, your records, your faith in the system. These aren't the monsters who break in, they're the ones who never leave. Between 1982 and 2006, 5 American killers operated in the thin space between trust and disappearance. None of them wanted fame. None of them left a manifesto. They studied patterns, lived quietly, and erased lives with the elegance of routine. Their crimes weren't crimes of passion. They were blueprints, designed, rehearsed, perfected. No blood splatter, no confessions. No one even looked twice until there was no one left to ask. You don't know their names, but you've walked past someone like them. You've shaken their hand. You've maybe even said thank you, and then they vanished. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you want more disturbing true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because the next one might be closer than you think. His name never made the news, but in financial courtrooms, tax offices, and fake consultancy websites across 3 Midwestern states, he was known by a dozen fake names, each one attached to a death. He called himself Walter Shaw in Indiana, then Greg Chalmers in Southern Illinois, then Randall Bowers in Ohio. But in every version of his identity, the job remained the same: debt restructuring. From 1989 to 1997, this man posed as a financial rehabilitation consultant, offering desperate small business owners a lifeline during tax audits, liens, and foreclosure seizures. His targets were always the same: single location owners, usually male, aged 40 to 65, who had recently defaulted on property taxes or employee wages. He'd call them pretending to be from the State Mediation Bureau. He'd fax them a brochure. He'd wear a cheap blue suit and arrive in person with IRS jargon on his tongue. They trusted him because he knew too much. But what they didn't know was that he had obtained their financial histories from stolen legal briefs and bankruptcy court dockets. His recovery programs included a clause: a 3-day mandatory off-site consultation where owners would transfer temporary operational control to him while he performed risk shielding. That's when he'd strike. Each man disappeared within 72 hours of signing the agreement. One was last seen entering a hunting lodge with Walter Shaw for a weekend tax reset course. His truck was found a week later with a dead car battery and a folder in the passenger seat, full of IRS forms, each marked draft, no body, no fingerprints. Another victim, a widowed mechanic named Barry Elton, was found hanging in his garage 2 weeks after signing the same document, ruled suicide. But the angle of the ligature mark didn't match the height of the beam, and there were 2 sets of shoe prints in the dust, one belonging to Barry, the other a narrow-soled formal shoe. Every case ended in suicide, disappearance, or natural cause, all right after control of their businesses shifted briefly to the man with the clipboard. What made him invisible was how real he looked. Every piece of stationery was legitimate. Every notary stamp traced back to a real, often deceased, registrar. Even the websites he used had SSL certificates and customer testimonials scraped from real defunct businesses. He didn't kill in rage, he killed in sequence. And every sequence ended with the same thing: a power of attorney signed by someone who never got to see its consequences. The most chilling piece of evidence surfaced in 2004 when a storage locker in Gary, Indiana was seized for non-payment. Inside, 6 rolling file cabinets, each labeled with victim surnames and dates of contact. In the drawer for Elton, police found a financial flowchart showing how his business was sold to a Shell LLC in New Mexico. Next to it, a receipt for burner phones. In the drawer marked Lang, officers discovered a duplicate death certificate dated 2 days before the body was found. And in the very last cabinet, behind a torn-out yellow legal pad with no writing, there was a plastic envelope containing 8 clipped photographs. Every photo showed a different business sign, all shut down. And in each, barely visible in the corner, was the same man. Blue suit, clipboard, head down. The man never spoke to neighbors, never returned calls, never left a real address. But he left behind a system so perfect that not even murder had to be part of it. Just paperwork, signatures, and silence. By the time investigators connected the missing men to the fake consultant, the man himself had already disappeared. No arrest, no trial, just residue, documents, shell companies, canceled cell plans, and paper trails that dissolved on contact. He wasn't improvising, he was updating. Each new alias brought with it refinements, tighter contracts, smarter vanishing points, and cleaner exits. His pattern was methodical. Step 1 was always surveillance. He would identify targets through court records, not violent criminals or predators, but struggling middle-class businessmen caught in red tape. Step 2, infiltration. Once he had the name, he would tail them for days, sometimes weeks, noting their routines, mapping their exits, even tracking which employees had access to office safes. Step 3, seduction through logic. His meetings weren't persuasive, they were surgical. He'd show up with binders of graphs, quote code from the Internal Revenue Manual, and pretend to simplify a world collapsing around his targets. That illusion of control made them sign. It wasn't charm, it was fatigue. And once they signed the financial custodianship waiver, he had legal cover for up to 5 days of total access, not just to their books, but to their assets, property, and mail. Step 4 was disappearance. He used prepaid rental cabins under pseudonyms, usually in off-grid areas with no surveillance, once even posing as a wilderness retreat coordinator. The victims always vanished from these locations. Some were found later, but none in a state that invited reinvestigation. One died in a carbon monoxide accident while trying to start a generator. Another supposedly drowned on a solo fishing trip, but the boat he was found in had its plug reinserted upside down, a trick that delays sinking just long enough to make the scene look accidental. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, just still water and a narrative that looked plausible. And in each case, financial damage followed, accounts drained, buildings transferred, debts erased and refiled under fake litigation claims in rural courts with backlogs. No one sued because no one understood what they'd lost until months later, and by then, the killer had cycled into a new identity, a new jurisdiction, and a new victim. His genius wasn't just killing without leaving blood, it was killing with paperwork. One investigator later noted that the deaths themselves may have only been half the point. The real harm was the vacuum. Employees suddenly jobless, families left with no closure, clients defrauded and confused. The killer weaponized infrastructure, and in doing so, erased people not just from life, but from business history. In 2006, a former IRS analyst turned private investigator named Elena Corbin began unofficially tracking the linked disappearances. Her breakthrough came not through fingerprints or cameras, but through language. She noticed that every fake consultancy the man used included the phrase provisional risk window, a term that didn't exist in any real tax mediation language. It appeared in 3 separate brochures across 3 different states, all attached to now defunct LLCs. Using this linguistic fingerprint, she traced the business registrations backward and discovered something chilling. Every address used in these documents had been connected at one time to a funeral home. He was registering his companies using the back office addresses of properties temporarily owned by morticians, spaces that changed hands so often they rarely updated with the state. He used their instability as camouflage. She compiled a report, handed it to the FBI, and waited. But the man had already vanished again. The last known trace appeared in 2007, when a woman in Omaha reported an odd interaction with a business debt recovery specialist who offered to help after her brother passed away in a business accident. The brochure she handed over included the same phrase, provisional risk window, but this time it had a watermark, a barely visible signature written diagonally across the background. Elena enhanced it. The name wasn't real, but it was one she'd seen before, once on a leasing agreement from a shuttered law office in Peoria. The man had looped back. He wasn't done. But after that, no sightings, no paperwork, no new frauds, just a hole. What haunts investigators isn't just that he vanished, but that his crimes were so perfectly hidden inside routine legal failure, they still aren't officially classified as murders. The FBI database lists most of his victims as unexplained accidental deaths. Their families list them as financial ruin. Only Elena calls them what they are: executions by paperwork, silent, deliberate erasures of men who trusted the wrong consultant. The man never touched them in rage. He didn't have to. He made them sign their own exits, and then disappeared into a system that rewards confidence and punishes doubt. And that's what made him terrifying. He didn't kill to feel power. He killed to create perfect endings, ones that couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be challenged, and couldn't be traced. He didn't vanish because he was afraid. He vanished because he was finished. Some killers move city to city, others hide behind fake names. But the next one never left her town at all. She didn't flee. She didn't flinch. She worked in plain sight, using silence, routine, and grief as her camouflage. And the people who trusted her most? They didn't just welcome her in, they invited her to stay. Her name was Lorraine Vesnick, and between 1991 and 2002, she quietly buried 11 people in the same town that called her a saint. On paper, she was a private grief counselor, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, a calming voice, and a home office filled with candles and laminated brochures titled Navigating Loss. She wasn't licensed, but no one asked. In a rural patch of Missouri where therapy was whispered about more than practiced, she filled a gap. Her clients were always grieving families, widows, parents of overdosed teens, siblings of accident victims. But Lorraine didn't counsel them through the stages of grief. She watched for something else: hesitation, vulnerability, a pause in their sentence when they said, "I don't know how to live like this." That was her cue. She didn't need credentials, she needed access. Over the span of 11 years, Lorraine became embedded in over 24 families. She helped with wills. She answered phones when no one could bear to. She even organized memorials, always suggesting simple services, cremations, and fewer questions. But what made her monstrous wasn't how she entered. It was how she left. One by one, she selected her next victims from inside these grieving homes. Always someone peripheral: an uncle with cancer, an adult daughter with epilepsy, a father with early Alzheimer's, and always someone she could help. She'd volunteer to take them to appointments, fill prescriptions, run errands. But what she was really doing was controlling the timing, watching, testing, experimenting. Her first suspected kill was Eliza Dawes, a 72-year-old woman with limited mobility who had recently lost her son in a car accident. Lorraine had helped arrange the funeral. A month later, she was Eliza's daily companion. Eliza passed peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks into their visits. No autopsy was requested. The doctor noted failure to thrive, and Lorraine wrote the obituary herself. But 3 years later, when the family cleaned out Eliza's attic, they found something strange. 3 unopened bottles of seizure medication prescribed to Eliza weeks before her death. Medication Lorraine was trusted to administer. The pharmacy logs showed all 3 were picked up. All three vanished unopened. Lorraine had never even opened the blister packs. Cause of death reclassified, inconclusive. But it didn't stop there. Lorraine struck again, a man with Parkinson's who slipped down basement stairs, a teen girl with depression who overdosed on sleeping pills that weren't hers, a middle-aged widow who developed sudden liver failure despite no history of illness. In each case, Lorraine had been there. She gave statements. She delivered sympathy. She offered to handle the aftermath. And in every case, the deaths were considered unfortunate, but plausible. She didn't inject. She redirected. She skipped doses. She swapped medications. Her kills looked like neglect, but they weren't. They were orchestration. And what truly shielded her was the nature of her presence. She was always around loss. Death followed her because that's what she dealt with. No one thought to question why it followed so closely. In 2000, the illusion began to crack. Lorraine had been helping a family navigate the death of their patriarch, a local math teacher named Willard Strand, when his son, Curtis, began asking questions about his mother's sudden hospitalization. She'd collapsed at home after what Lorraine described as a fainting spell. But lab results showed her potassium levels were catastrophically low, consistent with deliberate diuretic overdose. When doctors pressed, she mentioned Lorraine had been helping with her meals. The diet log Lorraine provided didn't match the actual ingredients in the refrigerator. Further discrepancies followed. Medications missing, nurse appointments canceled. But Curtis couldn't get answers. His mother survived, barely. But by the time he tried to contact Lorraine again, she was gone. Not out of town, just absent. No return calls, no visits, no signs she'd ever been there. She had packed up her office, closed her P.O. box, and left behind nothing but a broken answering machine message that said, "I'm no longer taking clients. Please heal in your own way." And that was the moment authorities finally opened a pattern file. When authorities tried to retrace Lorraine's movements, they hit a wall. Not a dead end, a constructed silence. Every record of her practice was unofficial. She never filed taxes under the name Lorraine Vesnick Counseling. She had no business license, no medical certifications, no registered address beyond a rented mailbox inside a copy print shop. Her phone was a prepaid flip model. Her brochures were printed at local libraries using a different design for each region. She left no digital trail because she never had one. No social media, no credit cards, no online payments. She lived on cash, moved seasonally, and rented single rooms in the homes of widows who'd lost someone the year before. Grief was her passport, and she crossed borders with ease. The only consistent evidence came from a woman named Eleanor Bishop, a retired teacher whose daughter had died in a kayaking accident in 1999. Lorraine showed up at her door 2 weeks later, holding a pamphlet and a basket of candles. She told Eleanor, "Sometimes it helps to talk." Within a month, she was in the house twice a week, then daily. Eleanor, emotionally wrecked, let her stay overnight sometimes. That was when the phone bills changed. Calls were made to funeral homes across 3 states. One bill included a 17-minute call to a pharmacy in Arkansas, even though Eleanor hadn't left Missouri. Later, when Eleanor's memory began to falter, Lorraine offered to help with forms and requested power of attorney, citing memory fog as a reason. The paperwork was drafted but not filed because Eleanor's niece arrived unexpectedly for a surprise visit and immediately grew suspicious. Lorraine left that night, vanished. But the paperwork, left behind in a filing drawer, revealed something chilling. Under the power of attorney draft were scribbled notes in pencil. "History of mild dementia, use this, and call Dr. Marcus for updated prescriptions. Get new bottles." The handwriting matched notes found later in the homes of 2 other victims. But still, nothing prosecutable. No direct evidence of harm, just fragments of preparation. What finally connected the dots came not from a lab, but from a funeral planner. In 2001, a mortuary director in Jefferson County noticed that a woman, whom he knew as LV, had coordinated 5 cremation services in the last 2 years, each for a different family, each paid in cash, and each requesting expedited no-view cremations. His curiosity was piqued not because of the volume, but the uniformity. The forms she brought were all notarized by the same individual, a man who had died in 1997. His stamp was outdated, yet it had appeared on documents filed in 2000 and 2001. The director submitted a quiet inquiry to the county registrar, who looped in law enforcement. An audit was opened, and the web began to unravel. Investigators combed through death certificates, power of attorney filings, and pharmacy pickups connected to Lorraine's known aliases. They found 6 names she had used, each one tied to at least one suspicious death: a fall, a collapse, an overdose, or a sudden respiratory arrest in someone previously stable. The pattern was obvious once you looked, but that was the trick. No one had ever looked. Her presence had been justified by grief. Her methods were disguised as mercy. She never physically forced anything. She simply controlled schedules, missed doses here, added ones there, requested cremations before autopsies, filed paperwork that looked legal until you stared too long. In one case, she arranged a hospice admission for a man with stage 2 lymphoma and told the staff he was declining rapidly. He died 2 days later after a medication interaction no one caught. Lorraine had administered the dose, signed in as a family friend, then disappeared before follow-up. What sealed her file as a killer rather than a suspicious caretaker came in 2002, when a nurse named Janelle Trost, who had once worked with Lorraine on a memorial planning committee, found an unlabeled manila envelope inside a second-hand filing cabinet she purchased at an estate sale. Inside were handwritten notes, grief assessments, family trees, medication plans, and a list titled Readiness. 11 names. Each one was deceased. Next to each name, a timeline, a weakness, a strategy. C strand, low K tolerance, use banana rotation, phase 3 equals sleep. It was a plan, a kill list dressed in caretaking language. When she brought it to police, handwriting experts confirmed it matched Lorraine's notes from the Bishop House. The FBI opened a formal investigation. A warrant was issued. But Lorraine was already gone. Her last known sighting came from a motel clerk in North Dakota who remembered her because she paid for 4 nights in. Quarters, no ID, no car, just a duffel bag and a book of obituaries she said she was revising. They searched the room after she left. The only thing left behind was a half-burned votive candle and a business card, blank except for the phrase, "Loss is where we meet ourselves." That card appeared again 6 months later, mailed to a woman who'd spoken to the press about Lorraine. No return address, no message, just the card. That was the last contact anyone had. Lorraine Vesnick, if that was ever her name, disappeared entirely. No digital signature, no financial activity, no confirmed sighting. The only thing investigators could do was reclassify the deaths she left behind as open with concern. Not murder, not accident, just concern. The families never got closure. Some still believe Lorraine meant well, others refused to speak her name. But the nurses, the morticians, and the quiet team at the State Forensic Board know the truth. She wasn't a healer, she was a harvester. She didn't kill out of rage or revenge. She killed because she could. Because she knew grief opens doors no one dares to check. And once she walked through, she never needed to break anything. She just waited until the dying stopped asking questions and the living were too tired to care. Some murderers use ropes, others use pills. But the next killer never touched his victims at all. He used machines. He used systems. And what he took wasn't bodies, it was control. Their eyes never even saw him, but their lives were rewritten by him, one keystroke at a time. He was known in cybersecurity circles only as Northnell, a faceless intrusion artist who never hacked banks or government files, just people. From 1997 to 2009, 5 victims across 4 states were found dead in circumstances that appeared self-inflicted. Overdoses, jump sites, lone car crashes. But buried inside each victim's digital life was a fingerprint, a presence that had rewritten their online identity from the inside out. Northnell didn't just stalk his victims. He transformed them into the architects of their own collapse. His targets were high-risk white-collar professionals, mid-level corporate managers, compliance officers, data administrators, people with access but no power. His motive wasn't money, it was pattern recognition. Northnell monitored the dark web for leaked HR files, workplace surveillance footage, and metadata tied to personal emails. Using stolen employee assessments and personality tests, he built psychological profiles, not to blackmail, but to reshape. Once selected, his first step was subtle. He altered their calendars. Meeting reminders shifted, emails were delayed, lunch appointments mysteriously rescheduled without notice, small confusion, low-grade anxiety. Then came phase 2, isolation. He would spoof emails from supervisors implying demotions. He'd reroute calls so that voicemails piled up undelivered. Colleagues grew distant. Friends didn't return messages because they never received them. His victims, now confused and socially destabilized, began to doubt themselves. But it didn't stop there. Northnell accessed HR systems and quietly modified vacation days, benefits, and ID access logs. One man was locked out of his own office 3 times in 2 weeks, each time blamed on a glitch. Another discovered his email signature had been changed to include a quote he never wrote. "It's all downhill from here." He was reprimanded by HR, then suspended. Then he disappeared. It was ruled a suicide. But the phone found beside his body contained a ghost application, one no carrier could trace. A clone app, running silently, mirroring his contacts and rerouting his outbound messages to a second destination, Northnell's server. The killer had been inside the man's phone for 4 months, and that man was not the only one. Across multiple cases, digital forensics teams later discovered strange similarities. Deleted contacts reappearing in call logs, facial recognition unlocks from unfamiliar angles, bank transfers set up but never completed, all signs of slow erosion, not theft, not aggression, just decay. The victims unraveled gradually. Their searches shifted from how to recover files to how to disappear legally. But their real disappearance was already underway, not in person, but in reputation. Northnell forged disciplinary letters, leaked fake harassment claims, and even falsified browser histories to include unethical queries. Employers began to distance themselves. Friends blocked numbers. Family members started receiving anonymous messages claiming their loved one was involved in something. In one case, a man's wife received screenshots of him texting another woman, but the metadata showed the texts had never existed in his actual thread. They were synthetically generated. AI written, inserted, and screenshot using deep UI emulation. A year later, that man drove into a quarry and was never found. Police called it high-functioning paranoia turned psychotic break, but his hard drive told another story. Buried in hex code was a file labeled _undo inside, line after line of behavioral triggers, times he'd panicked, calls he missed, passwords he reset but didn't remember creating. Northnell had documented everything, not for fun, for control. In his mind, he wasn't ending lives, he was deleting corrupted files. The brilliance of his operation was that it never technically touched anything physical. He used public Wi-Fi traffic, spoofed domains, and deepfake-generated voicemails. In one case, a victim received a call from what sounded like their spouse, asking them to meet at a location, only to arrive and be reported as trespassing on private land. A month later, that victim was found dead in their bathtub with no note, no sign of force. But their browser history was blank, wiped within minutes of death. The only open tab, a blank email addressed to no one. In forensic review, it was discovered that the device had connected to a masked IP address 1 hour before death. The address traced back to a compromised server stack in Montana, abandoned since 2005. Northnell had used decoy infrastructure. He had rerouted the signal through 13 jurisdictions. The killer left behind no images, no fingerprints, just code fragments, orphaned processes, and login times that didn't match human schedules. At 3:17 a.m., one victim's account logged into 27 systems at once, performed no tasks, then shut down. A forensic linguist reviewing the text messages attributed to another victim found lexical anomalies, too clean, too patterned, indicating the messages were written not in grief, but by a syntax generator. In other words, the killer wrote the victim's last words for them, and that's what made him untouchable. He didn't cause the deaths directly. He constructed simulations, realities so destabilizing that his victims were blamed for unraveling under pressure. One investigator called him a psychological programmer. Another called him the first social extinction artist, but neither label stuck, because by the time any pattern emerged, the digital trail had dissolved. Encrypted drives, burned SIM cards, fake cloud backups with looping file corruption. Northnell never reused infrastructure. Every case was a fresh design. And he always ended with the same flourish, a backup file titled with the victim's birth date. Inside, nothing, just an empty directory. He wasn't collecting trophies. He was archiving silence. It wasn't until 2010 that a name surfaced. Not a real one, but a username recovered from a corrupted SSD mailed anonymously to a private security firm in Sacramento. The drive had no return address. It came in a padded envelope labeled Dead Signal. Inside, the firm's analysts discovered a root directory full of garbled strings, encrypted files, and one note.txt file that read, "Nothing is gone if you remember where it went." The data took 9 months to partially decrypt. What they found was chilling. Over 6,000 log entries, not victims, test subjects, names, behavioral triggers, psychological flags, calendar metadata, and even references to wearable health data, like sleep apnea patterns and cortisol rhythms. Whoever Northnell was, he had been building something beyond surveillance. He had been building scripts, digital blueprints of human collapse. Each script followed a structure: destabilize the victim's digital communications, isolate social confidence, erode institutional trust, simulate misconduct, and finally trigger a decision point. In 83% of logged cases, that decision point ended in event confirmed, believed by investigators to refer to suicide, disappearance, or total social withdrawal. In one sequence, the notes described a man who had once filed a whistleblower complaint within a manufacturing firm. Over 18 months, Northnell redirected 44 of his emails, inserted fake Google Calendar invitations that clashed with supervisor meetings, and placed subtle typos in every job application he sent, just enough to imply laziness. His wife left him. His brother stopped responding. His landlord accused him of property damage he never caused. All of this while Northnell cloned his web history and began slowly injecting disturbing queries. Isolate guilt memory, Can God forgive suicide? How to delete medical record permanently. The man died of a barbiturate overdose in an abandoned mobile home. No note, no signs of intrusion. But buried in his hard drive's partition was a temp folder with dozens of screenshots of sites he never remembered visiting. The logs had timestamps. All of them occurred while he slept. Northnell had installed a remote scheduler that ran between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., generating artificial browser sessions that built an invisible digital character, one that replaced the victim's actual behavior with something darker. This false identity was then used to leak disinformation, HR complaints, social posts, internal messages. Each collapse followed a similar arc, but never exactly the same. That was the signature, not repetition, but calibration. He tailored every script to a new personality type, always beginning with data stolen from corporate onboarding assessments, or in one case, a church therapy registry. Nothing was sacred. Nothing was off-limits. One woman who worked in data privacy policy for a regional credit union began receiving wellness check calls from doctors she'd never met, because Northnell had submitted online forms using her real name and address, claiming suicidal ideation. When she denied them, she was flagged as non-compliant. Her company placed her on leave. Days later, her inbox filled with anonymous messages accusing her of falsifying health insurance forms. The accusations had no basis, but the records had been modified, not by hacking into the company, but by submitting public corrections via a known but unpatched vulnerability in third-party HR software. She was suspended, then let go. 3 months later, her house was found empty. Inside, her computer had been physically destroyed, but the hard drive platter, recovered and reconstructed over years, showed a chilling echo, a notepad file open in the background with no content. Just the file name, I trust no one. The software used to generate it matched a low-level developer tool built in 1998, long deprecated. The killer wasn't just using old tools. He was embedding his work in digital fossils, and every time authorities got close, the trail went cold. In 2013, after a regional spike in technology-adjacent suicides, a task force quietly formed inside the FBI's cyber division. They gave the case a file name, Project Silhouette. Using fragmented code and incomplete logs from the dead signal drive, they attempted to triangulate the IP addresses linked to Northnell's operations. What they discovered made no sense. All of the addresses had been registered not to humans, but to companies that had gone out of business years earlier, several before the internet even existed. Someone was registering legacy IP space through dormant administrative tunnels, loopholes that barely any engineer still knew about. And the few people who did were dead. One had died in a hiking accident in 1995. Another in a car crash in 2001. A third was reportedly killed in a mugging in Prague in 1999. But all had ties to early packet routing standards, the very protocols Northnell was manipulating. The deeper they went, the more time broke down. Some of the malicious code fragments contained timestamps from the 1980s, impossible unless the server clocks were forged, or unless the attacks were being staged through emulated environments older than the attackers themselves. At this point, some on the task force proposed a terrifying theory. Northnell might not be a single person. He could be an inherited system, a set of scripts and logic passed between engineers, coders, maybe even whistleblowers or digital saboteurs. But that theory crumbled when they found the voice sample. In one recovered voicemail sent to a victim's work line, a garbled robotic voice said, "You'll remember this pattern again soon." Audio engineers isolated the waveform. It wasn't text-to-speech. It was real, distorted but human. They layered the spectrogram against FBI biometric voice prints and came back with one partial match. a software engineer from Northern California who had vanished in 1992 after being investigated for industrial sabotage. His name, redacted. His body, never found. His house, abandoned. Inside his old garage, discovered by agents in 2014, they found the remains of a workstation built into the chassis of a vending machine. The monitor was smashed, but on the inner wall of the casing, etched in scratched plastic, were the words, "It doesn't matter who, it only matters when." Whether it was him or not, the implication was clear. Someone had kept the system alive, and now, even in silence, it was still operating. The last confirmed death attributed to the Northnell pattern occurred in 2017. A compliance officer in Des Moines was found unconscious in her office, phone in hand, browser open to a page that read, "You've already left." Forensics showed 42 modified system logs in the previous week, none generated by her. Then nothing. No new incidents, no new patterns. But in 2020, a cybersecurity analyst working in Houston received an email on a decommissioned burner account. No subject, no sender, just a file attachment. Inside, one sentence. The reset is complete. The file was deleted moments later by a self-executing script before anyone could trace it. Whether it was real or not, no one knows. But no new patterns emerged after that day. Northnell disappeared as if he had never existed. No convictions, no arrest, just a folder full of erased names and a generation of digital ghosts that no firewall ever saw coming. Some killers stage scenes, others vanish without a trace, but the next one left his signature in blueprints. His crime scenes weren't messy, they were measured, drawn to scale, layered behind drywall, and filed under zoning permits no one ever reviewed. He didn't break in, he built around you. His name was officially never recorded, but across Florida, Georgia, and parts of South Carolina, a dozen foreclosed homes between 1993 and 2008 were later tied to death certificates filed within 90 days of a renovation, all managed by the same small contractor licensed under variations of the name M. Levon. The man arrived with a clipboard, a handshake, and a smile that made realtors feel at ease. He never pushed. He promised quick flip projects, interior reconstructions, code compliance retrofits. He worked under the radar, hired through verbal agreements, paid in checks made out to small LLCs with names like Brass Anchor Build Company or Dryland Home Revive. Each time he worked alone, and each time someone died nearby, not in the house, but just close enough to link and just far enough to ignore. A neighbor, a prior owner, a family member helping move out, always someone attached to the property by memory or grievance. The pattern started with a widow named Estelle Franks, whose foreclosure was processed in 1994. Her husband had died in that home, a supposed aneurysm in the attic. But when the attic was later torn out and replaced by M. Levon, the contractor asked the realtor for a hammer that matched the beam spacing. She found that odd. The attic beams weren't visible from the hatch. She forgot about it. 3 weeks later, Estelle was found dead in a hotel room, her lungs full of carbon monoxide, a half-finished eviction form beside her. No foul play suspected. But a receipt surfaced years later showing she'd purchased a new CO detector the day before. It was never found, and neither was the contractor. The name he gave the realtor never matched his licensing file. That became his method. Each victim appeared to die from something believable: a structural accident, a misstep, a tragedy on moving day. But the structures had been tampered with. In 1997, a family moving into a newly flipped ranch home in Ocala found that their garage door opener triggered the gas fireplace. County inspectors wrote it off as miswiring. But 3 months earlier, the former owner, a retired teacher named Neil Rexton, had died in a single-car accident on a gravel road after reportedly swerving to avoid a man carrying lumber. No witnesses, just a pile of lumber later found stacked at the edge of the road, tied together in a configuration matching contractor haul rigs. Investigators never asked questions, but what they missed was that Rexton had filed a claim against the buyer, alleging underpaid value due to unapproved renovations done in secret. No renovation records were found, but the buyer's name, an LLC owned by Brass Anchor, again, the same contractor. He didn't leave blood, he left adjustments, things that would only make sense if you knew the house before and after. Subtle shifts. Vent placement moved half an inch, load-bearing beams shaved slightly, basement staircases that creaked at one particular step, only after a structural transfer. These weren't construction errors, they were warnings, messages to former owners that the house no longer belonged to them. One family reported a guttural hum in their central air system that only played between 2 and 3 a.m. It turned out to be a small speaker hardwired into the vent, triggered by a motion detector placed behind a faux cabinet in the basement. It played a slowed-down loop of what sounded like someone saying, "Should have let go." The family had bought the house from a man undergoing bankruptcy. That man died 2 weeks before move-in. Heart attack. But the EMS log noted that all 4 of his medications had been misfiled in the wrong pill organizer tray. The caregiver had been a local handyman helping him sort the house before sale. The man's handwriting on the check? Monsieur Levan. In every case, the killer positioned himself just outside the frame, helpful, temporary, quiet. He never stayed in one spot. He never filed formal permits. He subcontracted himself to brokers desperate to flip properties fast. But his true obsession wasn't flipping houses. It was flipping justice, watching former owners who resisted eviction, fought legal action, or demanded compensation fall apart, one renovation at a time. His kills weren't clean, they were layered. One man died of fume exposure after sleeping in a house with an improperly sealed water heater, a heater installed by Dryland Home Revive. The death was ruled accidental, but 5 years later, during a demolition, workers discovered the vent line had been routed back into the wall cavity, hidden by a false drywall panel and painted to match the room. Someone had designed the poisoning, and that was the key: design. His murders weren't improvised. They were engineered, coded into the framing and fixtures of forgotten homes, disguised as repairs and executed by proximity. He let the structures do the work. The most terrifying part of his strategy wasn't the death toll. It was the silence that followed. Because unlike most killers, he never repeated the same configuration twice. One house used gas, another used stair angle, a third used electromagnetic interference from rerouted wiring spliced behind a drywall mirror, which caused a pacemaker to malfunction in a woman helping her brother clean out the garage. She collapsed. The death was ruled a spontaneous cardiac failure, but when the mirror was removed during a later inspection, behind it was a lattice of wiring zip-tied in a pattern that didn't match code. Investigators brought in an engineer. The engineer said the setup was intentional, a loop designed to emit a specific low-frequency pulse. The question wasn't why, it was who. The seller was dead. The buyer didn't notice, and the contractor listed on the original invoice an out-of-state sub-license from a dissolved company in Jacksonville with the name B. Anchor scrawled in pencil on the corner. A warped version of Brass Anchor. Every time someone tried to follow the paper trail, they found wood pulp instead. Burned records, closed files, vanished permits. He never worked from his own address. He never filed taxes under one name more than once. Instead, he mapped his projects based on foreclosure auctions and estate transfers, targeting homes whose owners either fought the bank or died mid-process. That way, the legal chaos provided cover. The homes were already unstable. Any death that followed could be blamed on stress, neglect, or accident, and he made sure of that. In one home, later examined by a private forensic architect, the pressure valve in a second-floor guest shower had been swapped, not removed, just swapped, so that when activated, it would create a burst that overloaded the water heater's expansion tank. The resulting leak weakened the floor joists over several weeks. The new buyer fell through the ceiling into the living room on their third day in the house. They broke their spine, but they survived. When questioned about the seller, the buyer only recalled a soft-spoken builder who said he'd test the plumbing personally. No receipts, no ID, nothing. Just another temporary ghost with a level tool and a clipboard. Authorities couldn't touch him because he never finished the job, legally speaking. His name was never on the final invoice. His work was never part of the inspection. He arrived before the flip. He planted the fracture. And then he left. The houses weren't haunted. They were timed. His final suspected kill came in 2008, when a recently divorced woman named Letitia Carr moved back into her childhood home after buying it from her sister. The home had sat empty for years, and she hired a low-cost contractor she found through a real estate forum. He was recommended by a neighbor, though no one in the neighborhood recalled such a person. Letitia paid in cash. Within a month of his work, she started hearing a clicking sound behind the walls at night. She called pest control. They found nothing. Then came the smell. Days later, she died from chemical asphyxiation, a result of sulfur dioxide buildup released from a slow drip pipe embedded into the rear of the drywall. The substance had been stored in a ruptured cylinder fitted behind a false panel, the same panel the contractor had installed to cover moisture damage. The tank had no serial number. The connection points were welded, not screwed. It wasn't a repair, it was a weapon. Letitia had once sued a cousin over ownership of the house. Her cousin died in 2004 in a storage unit fire. The storage unit, located behind a property flipped by Dryland Home Revive. No one connected the dots until 2011, when a freelance journalist named Amir Raleigh began researching foreclosure-related deaths in the Southeast. His pattern recognition software flagged an anomaly. In 9 out of 12 cases, the contractor listed had some variation of the words anchor, dry, or lev. That's when the map began to take shape. Amir compiled property records, permit filings, and interviews with homebuyers, realtors, and locksmiths. He built a case file with floor plan overlays showing architectural modifications. Vents moved, wall cavities thickened, floor joists spliced. A forensics team from Atlanta volunteered to examine one of the suspect homes. What they found behind the paneling was horrifying. A series of nails driven at exact 6.66-inch intervals, a signal only someone inside the build would notice. Ritualistic, maybe a warning, or maybe just a mockery, but it was real. Investigators reopened 5 cases. They traced phone records from subcontractor referrals and cross-referenced addresses with contractor tool purchases from regional hardware stores. One store manager recognized a receipt signature. He'd seen the man, said he was always buying washers, but never returned anything. Security footage was pulled. The image was blurry, the timestamp corrupted, but the man wore a tan work jacket with a logo partially legible, V & Sons Restoration. The business never existed, but the font matched that of a fake contractor listing that had appeared on Craigslist 3 years earlier. A trap. Even in exposure, the killer had already covered the next leak. Amir's case file was submitted to federal authorities. The FBI began a quiet investigation under structural malfeasance with criminal intent. But nothing came of it. The names were fake, the paperwork gone, and every house sold, painted, repaired, re-inhabited. The evidence buried under drywall and time. By 2015, Amir stopped publishing. His last blog post ended with 3 words: "He builds graves." No arrests were ever made, no charges filed. But those who saw the case file, those who stood in those rooms and touched the edges of vents that weren't supposed to be there, they know. He didn't kill out of passion or profit. He killed with purpose. Each victim was tied to a grievance, a contested title, a refusal to let go. And so he gave them a house that didn't either. One that remembered, one that retaliated, one that collapsed only when no one was looking. He wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He was a demolitionist of memory, a man who turned structural design into revenge, one blueprint at a time. Some killers wear hard hats, others hide in code, but the last one wore grace like a mask. He didn't need darkness. He didn't need weapons. All he needed was a folding chair, a podium, and a promise that no one would ever hurt you again. He didn't hunt the lost. He invited them. His name was Malcolm Cray, though few knew it. Across the southern Midwest, he was only ever called Pastor Ray, a self-ordained grief minister who ran traveling healing ministries between 1995 and 2005. The gatherings weren't large, 20 to 30 people at most, always in converted basements, rented VFW halls, shuttered community centers. His flyers never advertised a church. They said things like, "Closure is a choice," or "Have you survived the first loss, but not the second?" His targets were always people still stuck in grief, widowers, mothers of missing children, survivors of car wrecks or house fires. He selected his cities through public obituaries and court listings, often arriving in town within 6 weeks of a high-profile loss. That was his window. He didn't preach hell or scripture. He preached logistics. He'd speak softly about how healing was harder when it was lonely. He'd ask for no tithes, no offerings, just names, and people gave them. They signed their names, addresses, and histories onto prayer request sheets. And that's when his work began. Over the next several weeks, he would visit select attendees, always those with property, no close family, and a deep crack in their routine. He'd appear unannounced, offering to help organize storage, clean out closets, or bless the home. And he'd bring items, a photo, a candle, sometimes a lockbox, each one seeded into their life as a reminder. But they weren't religious. They were traps. One woman found a necklace from her dead daughter sitting on her nightstand, even though it had been cremated with her. Another received a letter postmarked 3 years earlier, in her late husband's handwriting. Investigators later learned it was a near-perfect forgery, down to the ink degradation. But by then, it didn't matter. The woman was dead. Gas leak, supposedly due to a pilot light failure, but her oven had been tampered with, the valve shaved to allow slow seepage. The killer's signature wasn't what he left, but what he made you believe. The same story repeated with slight variations. A man in Wichita, grieving the drowning of his son, found old toys rearranged in the basement after a visit from Pastor Ray. A week later, he died in a freak garage fire. Investigators claimed he fell asleep with a cigarette, but the man had been a recovering smoker for 11 years. Another victim, a woman who lost her husband in a workplace collapse, began reporting sounds in the attic. Her house burned down 2 days later. Arson was ruled out. The cause? Faulty wiring from a recent prayer light installation. No electrician had ever visited, but the damage originated from behind a mounted wooden cross she said Pastor Ray had gifted her. Each case carried the same eerie undertone. The victims believed they were being haunted by closure, not ghosts, not demons, but memories they'd never consented to reawaken. And by the time their lives began to spiral, Pastor Ray was already gone. His ministry left no forwarding address. The phone lines went dead. The folding chairs were stacked. The only common thread was that he always used paper. Paper flyers, paper sign-in sheets, paper pamphlets. No websites, no tax ID, no EIN, just a name and a number. And even the name changed. Sometimes he signed as Pastor R.J. Creighton, other times as Malcolm R.C. or Reverend C. Ray, but always the same signature at the bottom of the flyer, a barely visible phrase, "Where memory ends, peace begins." The victims never fought back. They welcomed him. They let him in. He didn't murder through force or manipulation. He murdered through ritualized acceptance. He made himself a safe space, then slowly seeded fear through familiarity. One woman reported smelling her deceased husband's cologne days before her fall down the stairs. The carpet was clean, the stairs were level, but the handrail was loose, unscrewed, then gently replaced with stripped anchors that gave just enough friction to feel secure, until it didn't. She died on impact. And the only person she'd seen that week, a soft-spoken pastor who said he'd been praying over the staircase. He didn't need to rush, he just needed time. Because his true weapon wasn't grief, it was suggestion. If a memory can be real, then so can its echo. And Malcolm Cray mastered echoes. Every time someone died, their friends would shrug and say, they were never the same after the loss. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. They had never been given the chance to recover, because someone had returned just enough of the past to drown in it. The unraveling began not with a body, but with a filing cabinet. In 2006, a storage unit in Tulsa was auctioned after non-payment. Among rusted garden tools and moldy file boxes was one locked drawer unit stamped with a faded label, Restoration Ministry Archives. Inside were folders, each labeled with a city name and year: Topeka 97, Wichita 99, Jonesboro 2002, and so on. Every folder contained prayer request sheets filled with names, dates of loss, handwritten grief notes, and in some cases, taped photos. But beneath them, buried between loose paper and folded flyers, investigators found something chilling. Floor plans, detailed sketches of specific homes, with red circles marked on stairwells, attic panels, water heaters, and medicine cabinets. Some had measurements written in inches. Others included dosage notes next to the words, "Available RX." No fingerprints were recovered. But one folder, Branson 2004, held a post-it with what appeared to be a checklist: widow, firm, garage, unlocked, date of flyer, December 11th. The handwriting matched two other notes found in deceased victims' homes. That was the link. A forensic handwriting analyst confirmed it. The same hand that labeled prayer flyers had also written on grocery notes recovered from 3 death scenes. Investigators finally had circumstantial proof. The Tulsa police launched a quiet inquiry, requesting records from regional coroner offices and tracking all deaths reported within 30 days of any known Pastor Ray event. The number was higher than expected, 27. Of those, 14 were ruled accidental, 8 were suicide, 5 were listed as natural causes. But in 21 of those cases, someone had reported odd activity in the weeks prior: strange sounds, misplaced heirlooms, familiar handwriting suddenly appearing, or a calm visitor who dropped off scripture cards unannounced. It wasn't enough to prosecute, but it was enough to worry. The real break came from a surviving attendee, a man named Joseph Freer, whose wife had died in a church bus crash 2 years earlier. Joseph had attended one of Pastor Ray's gatherings in Little Rock. He remembered the man clearly: soft hands, no jewelry, carried a jar of what he called comfort oil, and gave out tiny folded paper crosses. But Freer never let him into the house. Instead, he got suspicious. Pastor Ray had asked too many questions about his routines, his medications, his sleep schedule. "Just to know how the grief is hitting," he'd said. After the second visit, Freer installed a motion camera in his garage. 3 nights later, the sensor triggered. Someone had opened the breaker box. No power outage followed. But the footage showed a man in clerical black, partially hidden behind the garage door, glancing directly into the camera, then walking away. When Freer submitted the tape to police, the man's face wasn't clear enough to confirm. But the body language was unmistakable. He wasn't breaking in. He was checking, mapping, confirming a stage he'd set. Freer moved out the next month. 2 months later, another neighbor down the block, who had lost her daughter in a boating accident, was found dead from apparent carbon monoxide poisoning. The furnace had been recently inspected. No issues were found. But behind the unit was a matchbox-sized object glued to the intake panel. The chemical residue matched a band oxidizer used in antique photo development. The method was obscure. The access point, only reachable by someone kneeling behind the unit. She had no visitors in the 3 days prior, except one. A man who dropped off a healing book and asked if she needed help moving the memory items. When investigators revisited the case files from previous towns, they discovered a disturbing pattern. In several deaths, local pharmacies reported prescription pickups the victim never collected. The prescriptions had been called in, paid for in cash, and picked up by a man claiming to be a caretaker. The drugs varied: sedatives, heart medication, blood pressure pills, but always matched something that could be misused or altered. In some cases, the medicine had been replaced with over-the-counter lookalikes. In others, dosages were found misaligned. No lethal overdoses, just confusion, weakness, disorientation. In one case, a man died of a fall. He had taken 4 days' worth of blood thinners in 2 days, a dosage no sane patient would self-administer. His caretaker, according to a hospice nurse, had been a pastor who said he was authorized by the family. There was no file, no record, just a soft voice and a smile that made people step back and think, maybe I'm overreacting. That was Malcolm Cray's gift. He didn't force belief. He let it unfold, one comforting deception at a time. He knew how the body moved under grief. He knew when people stopped locking doors, when they started relying on memory, when they began to say, "He's been helping me so much lately." He made himself unremarkable, and that's why no one noticed when he stopped. After the Tulsa unit was discovered, the gathering stopped entirely. No flyers, no sermons, no folding chairs, just quiet. Some believe he was tipped off. Others believe the cabinet was planted, a deliberate leak to shut the door behind him. One final fold in the sermon. He was never arrested, never confirmed. But in 2013, a nurse working at a palliative care center in rural Kansas submitted an internal report about a grief chaplain who had visited one of her patients just hours before the patient died. She said the man's name was Ray, that he wore a linen satchel filled with letters, that he'd asked for 5 minutes alone to offer the last words the family didn't know they needed. She let him. When she returned, the patient was dead. No pillow mark, no injection, just stillness. The death was expected. The man was already fading. But when the nurse checked the drawers afterward, she found an envelope tucked beneath a Bible. Inside was a single page. Not a prayer, not a blessing. Just one sentence written in calligraphy. The loss has already happened. I simply closed the door. No fingerprints, no ID. The nurse called the chaplain agency the next morning. No one named Ray worked there. The camera at the front desk had been unplugged for maintenance. He was gone, and no one ever saw him again. Some still think he's out there, maybe not killing anymore, maybe just watching, waiting for the next obituary to whisper from a folding chair, "I know how it feels." But those who studied his pattern believe he never intended to be caught, because he didn't see what he did as evil. He saw it as kindness. A final moment of stillness in a storm no one else dared enter. But he didn't give peace. He gave paralysis. He didn't offer closure. He installed confusion. And in every case, the grief was real, until he arrived. Then it became something else. Something that still sits inside filing cabinets and burned floor plans and ruined lives. Because Malcolm Cray didn't just kill the grieving. He rewrote what grief meant, and in doing so made sure no one would ever trust help again. Some killers stab, others stalk. But these 5, they studied. They didn't take lives. They dismantled them, piece by piece. And when they disappeared, they took belief with them. Because the scariest killers are the ones you never saw coming.